Hyperion. Hi everyone, sorry for that, but I had to do it. My name is Andre and I'm here today to talk to you about another book review, this time Hyperion. But I just want to say we're already way past half 2023 and that is crazy. Time is going by so fast. I hope you've been having amazing reads for the first half of 2023 and I hope you have a to be read list that is enormous and that you can read as many as you can for the rest of the year. But anyways, let's move on to the book review of the first science fiction book in this channel. So Hyperion is the first book of a tetralogy, so a 4-book series, and it's written by Dan Simmons. The first book is now quite old. It was written in 1989, which was 34 years ago, and this book has won numerous awards back then when it was published. I think it won the Hugo, the Locus, the Arthur C. Clarke Awards, many others. I think there's a huge list of them. But even though this is a huge plus, being able to read a book that has won multiple awards, that is not the reason I chose to read it. I had several friends that recommended it to me and it was in my radar for quite a while, so I just decided to grab it finally after years of my friends trying to make me read it and give it a go. And the premise for this book sounds super interesting. I'm gonna read it to you guys. If you don't want to know anything about it, then just skip to this timestamp. On the world called Hyperion, beyond the law of the hegemony of man, there waits the creature called the Shrike. There are those who worship it, there are those who fear it, and there are those who have vowed to destroy it. In the valley of the time tombs, where huge, brooding structures move backwards through time, the Shrike waits for them all. On the eve of Armageddon, with the entire galaxy at war, 7 pilgrims set forth on a final voyage to Hyperion, seeking the answers to the unsolved riddles of their lives. Each carries a desperate hope and a terrible secret, and one may hold the fate of humanity in his hands. So sounds interesting, no? So let me warn you before we start into the review of this book that even though this book follows a wider narrative, it is actually composed of several short stories within it. These stories are basically the tales of the pilgrims that are doing this pilgrimage throughout the universe to reach the shrines of time. So this review will be slightly different because I want to chat to you about the tales themselves, but also I will be chatting about the categories after. So let's get into it. Let's first start with the tales. And if you don't want to know anything about the tales, then just skip for this bookmark. Not bookmark, timestamp. So the first one was called The Priest, and it was one of the best ones I read. It was impactful. Since it's also the first one, I feel like the reader is not ready yet for what is about to come, and that is a good thing. We are not prepared. We don't know what's going to happen. What type of book is this? What type of narrative it is? So once it happens, it can't be avoided. We are surprised by it. I think the plot starts eerie, you become suspicious, a bit scared at times because things are so weird, but it's engaging. It makes you want to read more and find out what's exactly happening. And the ending was so terrifying. I remember reading it and thinking, oh, this is not good, this is so creepy, but I loved it. And the characters were so well done. I could feel the fear, the desperation, the anxiety. It was so good to feel these characters this real. This was definitely one of my favorite stories across the whole book, and I think it was an amazing way to start this book. Now, The Soldier's Tale, which is the second one, was a bit of a downer compared to the first one. It didn't feel as exciting or as gripping, but at the same time, I'm not sure if that wasn't actually the author's intention. I think if we were always kept at 100 at all the times, we would actually become desensitized to it, and we wouldn't be able to feel emotions as deeply as we should. So I think this was actually a smart choice of the author. And in the end, this tale still fulfilled its purpose. It gave us a deeper sense of the world. It built on what we didn't know much of, and it added those details that allows us to continue the story, still feeling that we're moving on and not feel like it wasn't wasteful. I think for this tale, I would place it probably midway across all the tales. It's not the worst, it's not the best, stands right in the middle. Now moving on to the poets. I love this one. But this one, I also feel like it will antagonize or polarize a lot of people. I love it because it sounds like a rant or a rampage from a poet to society. It almost feels like a sermon instead of a tale. It feels like the poet is talking to us about what he thinks and what he feels, and maybe that won't be for many people. Maybe people don't like those tales that it just feel like we're being taught a lesson, and or that this crazy person is just talking and there's no plot happening. But there are still those parts happening. It's not the focus of this tale. I don't want to spoil what he talks about, but if you like when there's a bit of sarcasm or a bit of contemplation of society, which classic fantasy used to have lots of, then I think you'll like this. But if you're more focused on the fantasy world, on the fantasy genre, then maybe you won't like this one as much. And then we move on to the Scholar. The Scholar. I loved this one. This one was my favorite. This was the tale for twists and emotions. And the worst is, by now, we're comfortable with all the characters. We have lived with them for a bit, and we are linked, or we at least feel a connection with them. And that connection might be positive or negative. We might like some characters, we might dislike some characters, but in fact, the fact is that we already feel something towards them. And this tale suddenly turns everything, or not everything, but a lot of things around. The author was able to create one of those jaw-dropping moments when suddenly all the pieces come together and the light bulbs all go out in your brain, and you suddenly feel like everything makes sense. I love those moments, and the author did this one so seamlessly. It was perfect. And Dan Simmons was able to pull our emotions while doing all this. It wasn't like the plot twist came because he was betraying us in some sense. It came with the emotions, and then suddenly you could feel the characters that we were following so well, and you could feel what they were feeling, and it was just amazing. And I felt that this was such a contrast between the previous tale, because with the poet, it was feeling distant and impersonal. We were having this poet telling us what was wrong with our society. And then this one, we were so close to the person that we're following, and we're feeling so many deep things that it created this contrast. And I think it was perfect for what the author meant. As for the tale of the detective, this was the second last tale, and I felt it was again one of the lowest ones, slower, even though it still had some action, but I don't know, it felt slower, maybe more descriptive, maybe less emotional. And it was my least favorite, not because it was bad, but I think it was the one that added the least to my enjoyment of this story. I think because at this point we're almost done with the book, so there's not much to add, unlike the Soldier's Tale where we were at the start, so everything seems new. Now we've gone through so many ups and downs that this one is starting to lose the capacity to pull new things out of us. But of course, it was still worth reading, otherwise there would be a gap in our knowledge. It's just probably the one that I liked the least. And finally, the last tale, which is the Consul's Tale. Funny enough, I think this one is the worst, but it was not the one I enjoyed the least, if that makes sense. I think this tale relies in a lot of tropes that we've seen time and time again, but I think it still explores them in a unique way. It leads with themes of exploration and colonization, and it deals with them pretty well. And I think that's why I enjoyed this tale more than the previous one. I think my problem with that is it didn't have a huge bang. It was the last one, but I didn't feel I was surprised. I didn't feel pretty much anything towards the last one. It was just like, oh, okay, so this is the last tale. And I was expecting something more, especially something to the level of the scholar or of the priest. And after the tales, we still have an epilogue, but that follows the wider narrative, the pilgrimage that we have at the start of the book. And that is it. That's my brief thoughts about all the tales. Now we're moving out to the categories of this book, and we'll start with plot. For plot, I'm giving it a 4, saying it right from the start. Some of these tales are definitely a 5, I'm not going to deny that, but my problem is that some others, they're more like a 3, and the mid ones are like a 4. So on average, I would say across all of them, and together with the wider narrative, it's probably a 4. I think the overarching plot of the pilgrimage is really good, and it's a great vehicle to tell this story. And I think some of the other tales are amazing in the plot twists, or even in their plots, how they develop. So I think that's why the 4 is a good place for this book to be. But then again, I'm curious to read the next books and figure out what is happening from now onwards. As for the characters, I fell in love with them really easily. I think the characters are done so well. They seem real. You connect with them really easily. You might hate them, you might love them, but there is always some type of emotion attached to them. Whenever I was reading, I was feeling their desperation, their love, their sarcasm, whatever they felt, I was feeling it too. And for me, that signs that I really like this book, and the writing of this author links with me. I think as long as you don't go in the expectation that this is a 5 in fantasy, which fantasy has, I think, a very different way of dealing with characters. And even though I'm giving a 5 to this book for characters, I think it's a different 5, but nonetheless a 5. I was fascinated by the world Dan Simmons created, and I can't deny that. It was confusing at first. I wasn't very sure about what was happening, how things worked. But once you start delving into the tales, and with each tale you start getting more pieces about this world and how everything works and why they're doing what they're doing, suddenly things become clearer and you become more invested. And whatever questions weren't answered, they didn't feel like they were unanswered on purpose, or that simply the author didn't know what to do with them. They felt like mysteries that could be solved in future books, or even mysteries that aren't meant to be solved but that exist. And I love when there's that mystery that I want to know more about it. I hope there are books written about it, but if there aren't, I also accept that. It's the fact that it leaves you wanting more and wanting to read more books to know more about this world. I think that shows that it is a good written world. I think writing style is the mark of mastery for this author. Not only was the prose smooth and a joy to read, but it also felt like the author was experimenting with his skill. He was exploring subgenres within this book. We had a tale that felt like a horror or thriller. We had a military tale, a romance, a detective / cop style of story, and then we have the sermon. So there are all these different types of stories happening, and they didn't feel clunky or amateurish. It really felt like the author had written multiple books in all these subgenres, and now it was just inserting a small tale in this science fiction book. And it actually reminded me a bit of The Dark Tower by Stephen King. I know it has nothing to do with The Dark Tower, but I also felt that as I was reading the books of Dark Tower, each book was almost a subgenre within its overarching plot. So I felt like it was similar, but in one single book in regards to Dan Simmons. So for that, I'm going to give the writing style a 5 as well. And finally, enjoyment. I think this one is pretty easy for you guys to see. I've been ranting and ranting about this book and gushing and saying how much I loved it. So I think it's pretty clear it's going to be a 5. I love when a book is able to make me care immensely about the characters, and it's also able to surprise me the way this one did, to make me open my mouth and be like, no way, to the point where I want to go and tell everyone these stories because I want them to feel as excited as I feel. If I had had the second book right in front of me, I guarantee that I would have picked it up right away. And that's it, friends. So this is the summary of all the categories for Hyperion by Dan Simmons. And this means that the final score for this book is a 4.8 out of 5, which is practically a 5. And to be honest, might as well round up to 5. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay on the 4.8, but it's almost as if it is a 5. And I only give it a 4.8 because, like I said, some of the tales do have those less liked parts or plot that wasn't as good, things like that, and that's why it goes just below 5. So that, I think this assures that this is definitely a book to read. I mean, this is if you're into science fiction and if you're into short tales. So with all those conditions applied. So tell me, have you read this book? Which one of the tales did you like the most? Comment down below and let me know. Don't forget, like and subscribe. I hope you've been reading amazing things. If you have, please recommend. I'm always open to recommendations. And I'll be seeing you next time. Adeus.